Making of a global world. The pre-modern world. Many people think globalization is a modern economic system, but it actually started long ago in history. People have been trading, migrating, and sharing cultures for thousands of years. Throughout history, people traveled long distances for work, knowledge, spiritual reasons, and even to escape danger. They carried goods, ideas, and sometimes even diseases with them. Ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley traded with places as far away as West Asia as early as 3000 BCE, showing how connected societies have been for a long time. Silk routes linked the world. The Silk routes were important trade and cultural connections between different parts of the world in pre-modern times. These routes got their name because Chinese silk was a key item traded along these routes. There were several silk routes, both by land and sea, linking Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. These routes existed before the Christian era and were active until around the 15th century. Along with silk, Chinese pottery, Indian and Southeast Asian textiles and spices were traded on these routes. In exchange, gold and silver flowed from Europe to Asia. Trade and cultural exchange happened together with early Christian missionaries and Muslim preachers using these routes. Buddhism spread from India through the Silk routes, connecting different regions. Food travels. Spaghetti and potato. Food is a great example of long-distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduced new crops to different lands as they traveled. For example, it is believed that noodles from China became spaghetti in the West, or Arab traders may have brought pasta to Italy. Similar foods also existed in India and Japan. Many common foods like potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, maize, and sweet potatoes were unknown in Europe and Asia until about 500 years ago. These foods came from the Americas, discovered by Christopher Columbus, and were originally grown by Native Americans. New crops like potatoes changed lives. In Europe, the poor ate better and lived longer because of potatoes. In Ireland, many peasants depended on potatoes. When a disease ruined the potato crop in the 1840s, many died of hunger. Conquest, disease, and trade. In the 16th century, European sailors found sea routes to Asia and America, which made the world feel smaller. Before this, the Indian Ocean was already a hub of trade with goods, people, and knowledge moving through it. India was a key part of this trade. When Europeans arrived, they expanded and redirected trade towards Europe. America had been isolated from the world, but after the 16th century, its land, crops, and minerals changed global trade. Silver from Peru and Mexico made Europe richer and helped finance trade with Asia. Stories of South America's wealth, like the legend of El Dorado, attracted many explorers. The Spanish and Portuguese began conquering America in the mid-16th century. Their success wasn't just due to military power, but also diseases like smallpox, which devastated Native American populations who had no immunity to that disease. In Europe, poverty, hunger, and religious conflicts made life hard. So many people fled to America. By the 18th century, slaves from Africa were forced to work on plantations, growing cotton and sugar for Europe. Until the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries, dominating Asian trade. But after the 15th century, China limited its overseas activities and the Americas became more important in trade, shifting the world's trading center to Europe. The 19th century, 1815 to 1914. The 19th century brought major changes in economies, politics, societies, cultures, and technology, all of which impacted each other. Economists highlight three key types of movements in international economic exchanges during this time. 1. Flow of trade, mostly involving goods like cloth or wheat. 2. Flow of labor, people migrating to find jobs. 3. Flow of capital, money moving from short-term or long-term investments across countries. These three flows were closely connected and influenced people's lives more than before. Though migration of labor was sometimes more restricted than trade or capital movement. Understanding these flows together helps explain the world economy of the 19th century better. A world economy takes shape. In the 19th century, food production and consumption in industrial Europe, especially Britain, changed significantly. Traditionally, countries wanted to be self-sufficient in food, but in Britain, this led to problems. As the population and cities grew, food demand increased and food prices rose. The government passed the Corn Laws to restrict food imports and protect British farmers, but this made food expensive. Industrialists and city dwellers protested, leading to the abolition of the Corn Laws. After this, Britain could import cheaper food and British agriculture couldn't compete. Many farmers lost their jobs and large areas of farmland were abandoned. People moved to cities or migrated overseas. As food prices dropped, people in Britain consumed more and demand for imported food grew. This increased food production in countries like America, Australia, and Russia. To support this, railways, ports, and settlements were built, requiring capital and labor. Around 50 million Europeans migrated to America and Australia in the 19th century, with 150 million people globally moving in search of better opportunities. By 1890, a global agricultural economy had emerged, bringing major changes in labor, capital, technology, and the environment. Food was now grown far from where it was consumed, often on large farms by workers who recently migrated. Railways and ships transported the food, with many low-paid workers from southern Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean working on the ships. In West Punjab, the British Indian government built canals to turn semi-desert areas into fertile lands for growing wheat and cotton for export, known as the Canal Colonies. This global shift wasn't limited to food. Cotton production expanded to supply British textile mills and rubber production grew as well. World trade increased 25 to 40 times between 1820 and 1914, with about 60% of this trade being agricultural products like wheat and cotton and minerals like coal. Role of technology. Technology played a key role in transforming the 19th century world with inventions like railways, steamships, and the telegraph. These technological advances were driven by social, political, and economic changes such as colonization, which led to better transportation systems like faster railways and larger ships. The trade in meat is a good example of how technology improved trade. Before the 1870s, live animals were shipped from America to Europe, but many died or became unfit to eat, making meat expensive. The invention of refrigerated ships allowed meat to be slaughtered in America, Australia, or New Zealand and shipped the frozen to Europe, lowering the shipping costs and meat prices. This made meat more affordable for the poor in Europe, improving their diets and promoting social stability. Better living conditions also helped gain support for imperialism abroad. Late 19th century colonialism. Trade and markets grew in the late 19th century, bringing prosperity, but there was also a darker side. For many countries, this expansion of trade and connection to the global economy meant the loss of freedom and livelihoods. European conquests in the late 19th century caused economic, social, and environmental damage to colonized societies. In 1885, European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa among themselves, drawing borders with little regard for the people living there. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and the US expanded their colonies during this time. Colonialism often had a destructive impact on the economies and livelihoods of the people in colonized areas. Rinderpest or the cattle plague. In the 1890s, a cattle disease called rinderpest spread across Africa, having a huge impact on people's lives and the economy. Africa had lots of land and cattle, and most people did not work for wages because they relied on their land and livestock for survival. Europeans wanted Africa's resources like land and minerals for plantations and mines, but there weren't enough people willing to work for wages. To solve this, Europeans imposed heavy taxes and changed inheritance laws, forcing people to work for wages. Rinderpest arrived in the late 1880s, brought by cattle from British Asia to feed Italian soldiers. The disease spread quickly across Africa, killing 90% of the cattle. The loss of cattle ruined African livelihoods, and European colonizers took control of the remaining cattle, using it to gain power and force Africans into the labor market. This is just one example of how European conquest disrupted societies in the 19th century. Indentured labor migration from India. The migration of Indian indentured labor in the 19th century shows both the good and bad sides of the time. While there was economic growth, there was also great hardship for many. Hundreds of thousands of Indian and Chinese workers were sent to plantations, mines, and construction projects worldwide, working under contracts that promised to return them to India after 5 years. Most Indian workers came from places like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Central India, and Tamil Nadu, where people faced poverty due to rising land rents, loss of jobs, and other hardships. Indian workers were sent to places like the Caribbean, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius, Fiji, and tea plantations in Assam. Agents recruited workers by offering false promises about the work, travel, and living conditions, and sometimes people were forced into migration. Conditions on the plantations were harsh, with little legal protection for the workers. Some called this system a new form of slavery. Despite the difficulties, workers found ways to survive and express themselves, creating new cultural forms like Jose in Trinidad and chutney music in the Caribbean, blending their traditions with local customs. Many workers stayed on after their contracts ended, leading to large Indian communities in these places today. Some famous people like writer V.S. Naipaul and cricketers Shiv Naren Chandrapal and Ram Naresh Sarwan are descendants of these workers. In the early 1900s, Indian leaders began opposing the system and it was abolished in 1921. However, the descendants of indentured workers faced discrimination and were seen as outsiders for many years. Some of the Naipaul's novels talk about this sense of loss and isolation. Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Growing food for the global market needed money, which large plantations could borrow from banks, but small farmers often needed help. Indian bankers like the Shikaripuri Shroffs and Natukottai Chettiars helped finance export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia. They used their own money or borrowed from European banks. These bankers had a system to transfer money over long distances and created their own business organizations. Indian traders and money lenders followed European colonizers to Africa. Hyderabadi Sindhi traders went even further, setting up shops at ports worldwide by the 1860s, selling goods to tourists as travel became safer and more common. Indian trade, colonialism, and the global system. In the past, India exported fine cotton to Europe, but when British cotton industries grew, they pushed the government to limit cotton imports to protect their businesses. Britain imposed tariffs on imported cloth, causing Indian cotton exports to decrease. By the 1870s, Indian cotton's share in global exports fell to below 3%. British manufacturers began exporting their cloth overseas, and Indian textiles faced tough competition in international markets. While manufactured goods from India declined, raw material exports like raw cotton increased rapidly. From 1812 to 1871, raw cotton exports rose from 5% to 35%. Indigo for dyeing and opium shipments to China became major exports. Britain used money from selling Indian opium to China to buy tea and other goods from China. British goods flooded Indian markets, and India exported food grains and raw materials to Britain. However, Britain exported more to India than it imported, creating a trade surplus with India. Britain used this surplus to balance trade deficits with other countries and to pay for private remittances, interest on India's debt, and pensions for British officials in India. Wartime transformations. The First World War was fought between two groups, the Allies, those are Britain, France, Russia, later joined by the US, and the Central Powers. They are Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Turkey. This war started in August 1914, and though many thought it would end quickly, it lasted over 4 years. This war was the first modern industrial war using new weapons like machine guns, tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons, all made by large industries. Millions of soldiers were recruited from around the world, and massive death and destruction followed. 9 million people died and 20 million were injured. Most of the dead and injured were working-age men, causing a shortage of workers and lowering family incomes after the war. Industries were changed to focus on war production, and as men went to fight, women took on jobs that were previously done only by men. Economic ties between major powers were broken, and countries like Britain had to borrow large amounts of money, especially from the US. The war made the US an international creditor because by the end, the US owned more overseas assets than other countries owned in the US. Post-war recovery. After the First World War, economic recovery was difficult, especially for Britain, which had been the world's leading economy before the war. During the war, industries grew in India and Japan. making it hard for Britain to regain its dominance in the Indian market and compete internationally. Britain had borrowed heavily from the US to finance the war, leaving it with large debts after the war. The war had created an economic boom with high demand and jobs. But after the war, production slowed and unemployment increased. In 1921, 1 in 5 British workers was jobless. The government cut war spending, which led to more job losses, creating anxiety about work in the post-war period. Agricultural economies also suffered. During the war, wheat production increased in Canada, America, and Australia to fill the gap left by Eastern Europe, a major wheat supplier before the war. After the war, Eastern Europe resumed wheat production, causing an oversupply. Grain prices fell, rural incomes dropped, and many farmers went deeper into debt. Rise of mass production and consumption. After the First World War, the US economy recovered quickly and started growing strongly in the early 1920s. The key feature of the US economy during this time was mass production, which allowed goods to be made faster and cheaper. Henry Ford was a pioneer of this technique, using the assembly line to produce cars at a much faster rate. On the assembly line, workers performed the same task repeatedly, making production quicker. But the pace was stressful and many workers quit the job. To keep workers, Ford doubled wages to $5 a day in 1914, which he later called his best cost-cutting decision. Mass production spread in the US and Europe, lowering costs and prices. Higher wages meant more people could afford products like cars, refrigerators, and radios. Car production in the US jumped from 2 million in 1919 to over 5 million by 1929. People bought household goods and homes using credit, which boosted the economy. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s led to more jobs, higher incomes, and more demand for goods, creating a cycle of prosperity. In 1923, the US started exporting capital to other countries, helping Europe recover and boosting world trade. However, this period of growth did not last, and by 1929, the world fell into a severe economic depression. The Great Depression. The Great Depression started around 1929 and lasted until the mid-1930s, causing a massive decline in production, jobs, income, and trade worldwide. The depression affected different countries at different times, but agricultural regions suffered the most because agricultural prices fell more than industrial goods prices. The depression had many causes. One was agricultural overproduction, where farmers produced more to keep their incomes up, but this only worsened the problem as prices dropped further. Another cause was countries relying on US loans for investments. When the US stopped lending during the crisis, many countries faced serious problems. The withdrawal of US loans led to the collapse of major banks in Europe, currency failures, and falling prices for agricultural and raw materials worldwide. The US was hit hardest by the depression. Banks stopped lending and businesses and firms collapsed, leaving many people unable to repay loans. People lost their homes, cars, and savings. Unemployment soared and many people were left searching for work. Over 4,000 banks closed by 1933 and about 110,000 companies failed between 1929 and 1932. A slow recovery began by 1935, but the depression had long-lasting effects on society, politics, and international relations. India and the Great Depression. The Great Depression showed how connected the global economy was by the early 20th century. A crisis in one part of the world affected economies everywhere, including India. India, which exported agricultural goods and imported manufactured items, saw its trade drop sharply. Exports and imports were cut nearly in half between 1928 and 1934. Prices in India fell along with global prices. For example, wheat prices in India dropped by 50%. Peasants and farmers suffered the most as agricultural prices fell, but the colonial government refused to lower the taxes that are the revenue demands and that they have to pay. Jute farmers in Bengal, who grew raw jute for export, were hit hard when jute exports dropped and the price of raw jute fell by over 60%. Many peasants fell into debt. To survive, peasants sold their savings, lands, and gold, making India a big exporter of precious metals during this time. Economist John Maynard Keynes believed India's gold exports helped global economic recovery, especially for Britain, but did little for Indian farmers. In rural India, unrest grew, and Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement during the Depression in 1931. Urban India had it somewhat easier as prices fell, benefiting those with fixed incomes like landowners and salaried employees. Industries also grew as the government gave them tariff protection under pressure from nationalists. Rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. The Second World War began just 2 decades after the First World War and was fought between the Axis powers, those are Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Allies, those are Britain, France, Soviet Union, and US. The war lasted 6 years with battles on land, sea, and air causing massive death and destruction. Around 60 million people died, making up 3% of the world's 1939 population, with more civilians than soldiers killed by war-related causes. Large parts of Europe and Asia were destroyed by bombings and artillery attacks, leading to severe economic and social disruption. Post-war reconstruction was shaped by 2 major influences. 1. The US emerged as the most powerful economic, political, and military force in the Western world. 2. The Soviet Union, after huge sacrifices, became a world power, transforming from a poor agricultural country into a major force during the same period when capitalist countries were struggling with the Great Depression. Post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. After the interwar economic experiences, economists learned 2 key lessons. 1. Mass production needs mass consumption to be sustainable, which requires high and stable incomes. Stable incomes depend on steady, full employment. 2. Governments must control the flow of goods, capital, and labor to ensure full employment, as markets alone cannot guarantee this. To maintain economic stability and full employment, governments needed to intervene in the economy. In July 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference was held, where a new international economic system was created to promote stability. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank were established to help countries manage financial issues and fund post-war reconstruction. These are known as the Bretton Woods institutions. The IMF and World Bank began operations in 1947, and decision-making is dominated by Western powers, with the US holding veto power over key decisions. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates, where national currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was anchored to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The early post-war years. The Bretton Woods system began a period of significant growth in trade and incomes for Western industrial nations and Japan. Between 1950 and 1970, world trade grew by more than 8% each year and incomes increased by nearly 5% annually. This growth was stable with few large fluctuations or economic downturns. Unemployment rates were low during this period, averaging less than 5% in most industrial countries. There was a worldwide spread of technology and business enterprises. Developing countries wanted to catch up with advanced industrial nations, so they invested large amounts of money. They imported industrial plants and equipment featuring modern technology to boost their own industries. Decolonization and independence. After World War II, many colonies in Asia and Africa gained independence, but they were left with poverty and lacked resources due to long colonial rule. The IMF and World Bank were initially designed to help industrial countries and were not suited to address the challenges of poverty and development in these newly independent nations. As Europe and Japan recovered, the IMF and World Bank started focusing more on developing countries in the late 1950s. Many developing countries, once colonies, were now guided by international agencies dominated by former colonial powers. Former colonial powers and large corporations from powerful countries like the US continued to control and exploit natural resources in these developing countries. Developing nations did not experience the same economic growth as Western countries in the 1950s and 1960s. So, they formed the Group of 77, G77, to demand a new international economic order, NIEO. The NIEO aimed to give developing countries more control over their natural resources, better development aid, fairer prices for raw materials, and improved access to developed countries' markets for their goods. End of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. Despite strong growth after World War II by the 1960s, the US economy weakened due to rising costs abroad. The US dollar lost its value and the fixed exchange rate system collapsed, replaced by a floating exchange rate system. From the mid-1970s, developing countries faced more challenges as they had to borrow from Western commercial banks instead of international institutions, leading to debt crisis, especially in Africa and Latin America. Unemployment rose in the industrial world from the mid-1970s and stayed high until the early 1990s. Multinational corporations, MNCs, began moving production to low-wage countries in Asia like China to reduce costs. After 1949, China had been cut off from the world economy, but in the late 1970s, new economic policies and the collapse of the Soviet Union brought China and other countries back into global trade. Low wages in countries like China made them attractive for foreign investment, and many products like TVs, phones, and toys are now made there due to the low costs. The shift of industries to low-wage countries boosted world trade and capital flows, transforming the global economy with countries like India, China, and Brazil undergoing rapid growth in the last 2 decades. This is all about the making of a global world.